For today's episode, it flew across the world to Munich, Germany. After a stop off at the Oktoberfest, we took the Autobahn to the SEOktoberfest G50 Summit at the beautiful Bio Hotel Stanglwirt, where I was able to shoot on location with Jono Alderson. Despite a lingering hangover and jet lag, Jono and I had a very interesting discussion around SEO, SEM, and how search engines have evolved over the last few decades. We discussed the Google antitrust lawsuits, Google's controversial AMP project, negative SEO, as well as how difficult it has become to avoid Google entirely. As the head of SEO for Yoast, Jono gets rare visibility into the inside baseball of the search world. With that, please enjoy the conversation I had with Jono Alderson. Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have with me Jono Alderson. How are you, sir?
Great, thanks. Yes. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. We are here at the Stanglwirt Hotel in Austria. We spent yesterday at the Oktoberfest in Munich.
Was that yesterday or was it the day before? It's already a blur.
Actually, I guess it was 2 nights ago. Yeah, but we drove in yesterday. That's why I'm thinking yesterday. So, I'm hungover and jet lagged, all the things. I could fall asleep right now in the middle of you talking. I won't do that. But you have an expertise around something called SEO, search engine optimization, and you are the head of search at Yoast, which presumably some people will have heard about, but not everybody is involved in the web as much as you are. Would you briefly explain what that is, just so people know what it is?
Yep. So a large proportion of websites run on a piece of software called WordPress, which almost certainly everybody has come across because it's so ubiquitous. It has such a low threshold of entry, has many problems and challenges, which I'm sure we'll scoot around at some point. But if you are running a website on WordPress and you want to get more clicks from Google, you want to be more visible, you want to outrank your competitors, you want to encourage people to visit your website rather than somebody else's, you want to be higher, you want to be enticing more users, we are a software package which gives you a whole bunch of tools and frameworks for doing that, some of which is technical and behind the scenes, some of which takes the form of guidelines and suggestions and hand-holding. Mm-hmm. And more recently, we are also on Shopify, which is quite cool.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. So just for the audience's sake, we're here at the conference called G50, SEOktoberfest G50, which is the 50 greatest SEOs in the world, of which you are definitely very near the top of the pack, if not right there. Well, it's true. And one of the reasons I think you're interesting is, for whatever reason, whenever we talk, we almost never talk about the same thing, but we almost always are in lockstep with almost everything we think about search and how search engines work and how people should monetize it and think about it. I mean, it seems like every single time.
That was exciting.
Yeah, my pen just decided to explode on me. I think it was at the altitude, I'm sure. Before we get into all of that, because I think that is worth spending some time thinking through kind of how you think about things, and I'm sure I'll agree with almost all of the things you think, just based on our previous conversations. But first, what is this conference? Why is it important? Just kind of explain a little bit about kind of how we got here and what it is.
Yeah, because this one's interesting. This is different to all the others. So I speak at so many events I've lost count of, and they range from kind of very technical, pure play SEO stuff to broader marketing strategy, futurology stuff. And they're all a bit samey. They're all aimed at a blended audience of agency and business backgrounds who are either new to the field or they're looking for quick tactics and to know they're going in the right direction. They're a bit homogenized. It's rare for them to be valuable for me as a speaker other than for branding and exposure and maybe some kind of conversion.
And homogenized in the sense that they're parroting the top 3 things you need to do.
Yep, and even beyond that, it's the same speakers traveling. Like there have been cases where I've spoken at 3 events in 3 weeks with the same speakers on the same flights. Mm-hmm. And it's very much reinforcing the status quo. There's very little which is creative or disruptive or challenging. Mm-hmm. So that is the kind of day-to-day. And then this sticks out because this one's scary. As you say, this is ostensibly the 50 best in the world, and the brief is come and share content of a type and at a level that you would never share anywhere else. Give away your best secrets, air all of your skeletons out of your closet, and impress and or intimidate, I guess, the rest of the group to the point where you get inverted back. Like there are certainly different tactics that come out of that. Like some people will go, I have this incredible tactic that nobody's ever seen, and some people will go, this nightmare is cooking in the background here that none of you have even seen. There's some really fascinating stuff. And it's genuinely intimidating to speak here, which forces everybody to up their game and to really push. So you get people who kind of fall into a lull of just speaking at these events, and then you get them here and they're different people and they're talking about stuff that drives innovation, that challenges thinking, that forces everybody to up their game. So it's really cool.
And the bulk of the people here are speakers. It's not like this is a audience made up of
no. There's not 2,000 people over there in the audience. It's like we are speaking at each other, and that's a different game. And people heckle.
Yeah.
Like you'll be halfway through your talk and you'll have a really solid point, and somebody will call bullshit.
Yeah.
And they will challenge you on the spot, and they'll rally the rest of the room, which is super intimidating. So you've got to be sure that you really know your story. And it also forces people to go narrower and deeper than I think they might otherwise. There's a tendency for us all to kind of flow into waxing lyrical about general marketing stuff, and that gets called out immediately. You want to go, I have something very tight that's very interesting that I know 10 times more than anyone else in the room about, and everyone leaves an expert. It's great.
And all the talks are quick. They're 20 minutes.
And timed.
So you don't
tight.
and timed. Yeah. So you really are on a clock.
And I'm used to doing like a 40-minute talk, which maybe bleeds over into 50 minutes if I'm not careful. So 20 is hard work.
Yeah, it is. And you speak very quickly. So
100 or so slides in 20 minutes is quite dense.
So I actually found my way to this conference almost by accident. I was brought in because it turns out security and marketing are weird bedfellows. Because it's funny, I talked to some people who are a little intimidated by me, like, oh, I don't go as deep as you do. And I'm like, well, I think of marketing as a subset of security, but I also think of security as a subset of marketing.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
I don't think of them as like, one is bigger or better or whatever. They're very intertwined, and if you're really good at one, you're going to naturally be pretty good at the other.
Yeah, that's cool. And I guess we were talking earlier about your kind of area of focus of being essentially things which are in the public domain, websites which are public, and everything you can learn by looking at those, sniffing them, detecting them, etc. Just not far off marketing, right? All of your marketing is the things you are putting in public and the influence that they have on the people who consume or discover them. And you mess up one, chances are you're doing the wrong thing with the other. It's the same processes.
And to your point, just since the audience didn't see my presentation, I also present at this conference. I was talking about the way in which you could theoretically look at the outside of a company and identify what the attributes of that company are for the purpose of doing prediction about what this company is worth from an M&A perspective. But again, the marketing ties into that. It's like, well, what are the marketing components of that thing? And that's where it's kind of back into your world. It's like, what does that look like? And
yeah, there's some fascinating overlaps. So I've been talking recently a lot about web performance, and because having a faster website correlates phenomenally well with making more money for a whole bunch of reasons around psychology and user expectations, etc. But what's happened that's really interesting in that field is in the last couple of years, Google have codified a standard set of metrics for measuring site speed. It's actually quite a complex concept. Like, what does fast mean? Is it the total number of seconds it takes to load, or there's a whole bunch of nuance? And in the process of having codified these metrics and provided tools for people to measure them, you can now score your website on a bunch of different axes. And what you find that's really interesting is that if a site is slow in different categories, you can infer a huge amount about where their challenges are organizationally. You can say, okay, it's been slow for 2 years. You probably have a backlog roadmap, which tells us that you're probably under-resourced in your dev team. And also this thing's broken. You can start to join the dots and infer a huge amount of budget allocation, staffing, capabilities, competency, resource prioritization, all of it. It's really interesting. Yeah, these worlds are very tight.
They really are. Like you could put the copyright issue, an old copyright on the web page. You could put that squarely in either camp. Well, obviously they're not updating the site because this thing's out of date. And therefore, which means they probably aren't putting patches in place, which means they're probably vulnerable to all kinds of stuff.
And nobody's job is to look at this.
And
so it's not going to fix in the next week or so.
That's right. It's going to stay broken forever.
Yeah.
But also in the marketing world, you're like, yeah, that means this content's never getting refreshed. That means Google doesn't care as much. And so this is very interrelated, which I find really fascinating. I always feel like the odd duck out at this conference because I'm the only security person here, but everyone has a tangential interest in security because they want to make sure their sites stay up.
Yeah, I mean, so SEO in the last however many years, decades, has very much progressed from tactical hacking, for want of a better phrase, how do we beat the machines, how do we find which levers to pull, from starting there towards very much now brand building. And yes, there are still tactical hacks and opportunities, but really the long game and the big wins are I'm going to grow a brand and create an empire and build a castle and make my website bigger and better and faster and stronger over time. And a huge amount of that is, okay, you're building a castle on top of architecture. And if somebody comes in and, you've got a big security issue or an accessibility issue, rips out those bottom bricks, your site crumbles, your reputation crumbles, your user preference crumbles, and your SEO is all intertwined with that. So yeah, these things are very much together.
Yeah, I don't think people really understand how interconnected things like Google's ability to tell that somebody bounced back to Google and how that's going to affect your rankings. Like those types of user metrics, Google is paying very close attention to those things.
Yeah, and there's huge amounts of speculation on how that might work. We're not entirely sure, but we do know that broadly that kind of the interactions that people have as they're going through search and a journey. So nobody searches for a keyword, consciously evaluates the results and then clicks one. We all bounce back and forward. We visit 5 different websites on 3 different devices over how many different days, and all of that's monitored. And yeah, you can understand a huge amount about, it looks like people consider, we have ranked this site first, yet everybody who clicks on it immediately comes back to the search engine and clicks the one underneath. Okay, that's wrong, swap them. And we see evidence, we see tangential evidence of all this sort of thing happening all the time at scale. So the user experience and the security and people's trust in sites in particular, really key.
And Sitespeed is another really good indicator of that. So from Google's perspective, this makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
What they don't want is for users to go to a site, think it's broken, and therefore think Google's broken for having recommended it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really difficult relationship that, Google is curating these websites and your experience on that website reflects on them. And if that goes wrong, then people imagine go and use Bing or some other search engine that no one's ever heard of.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I've literally met people who truly believe Google is the internet. Like, this is my internet.
Their experience of it.
So if anything goes wrong, they truly believe that Google's at fault. So they don't give the brand any sort of like, eBay's messed up today or whatever. No, they're like, nope, it's Google's fault.
Yeah.
So Google really has to penalize you just to make sure that their customers are served well.
Yeah, they can't afford to have a bad inventory. And I think this is something that the SEO industry struggles with. So there's an increasing trend where Google is extracting the content from websites and serving it in the search results. And part of that's for this reason, that is a better user experience than sending a user to a website that they don't necessarily trust, aren't necessarily familiar with, and even if they are, still have to learn. Like there's a cognitive load in, where's the navigation? How do I find this? Actually, if Google can do a good job of surfacing it directly in the search results, that is a far better user experience.
That is a very good point. Once upon a time, one of our marketing guys left in a company I used to work for, and he left me 150 different social profiles that I had to go change the password on. And these are all totally different kinds of websites. And what I realized extremely quickly is that every one of them fell into like super obvious, this is how to do it, or massive clusterfuck that took a lot of work just to figure out. And sometimes you had to do it on different websites. Sometimes you had to like authenticate with some other token. It's a bizarre, weird gauntlet. Sometimes it's under me. Sometimes it's under profile. Sometimes it's under change passwords. Sometimes it's under like settings and like
standard for this.
Nothing. And so to your point, the cognitive load that a customer has to go through just to even figure out what's on this page and scroll down to the point where they need to be. If a customer doesn't see what they want to see pretty quickly, that's a good opportunity to bounce.
And what we're seeing is there's a mind shift which people are really struggling with, which is we've built these empires and marketing systems based on the premise that we can get traffic from Google and then try and convert it. But the fundamental misunderstanding is that has never been your traffic. It's been Google's traffic, and it still continues to be Google's users, and it's in Google's best interest to not have those users experience friction and to have to click a website they don't understand. Right. So of course they're going to extract that content and share it themselves. And we're now facing an existential crisis where there is no good answer to how should this work. What are the economic models that benefit content producers if their content is just extracted and served into Google? How do I run a business which is fundamentally based on clicks if nobody is clicking websites and visiting them? There are no answers to any of these questions, but everybody's KPIs and everybody's bonuses and everybody's marketing machines are all based around this. So there's a real kind of evolution happening, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, we can talk more about that too. But so let's talk about Yoast for a second, because I think this is worth explaining. tell the audience what I think you and I already know about how incredibly pervasive WordPress is, and how important Yoast is for the community. This isn't some tiny little thing that, I mean, a lot of users are not going to know the word Yoast, but they're impacted by it whether they understand that or not.
Yeah, like most of the websites you visit as a real human being probably run Yoast. So WordPress now powers 43, I think, % of the web, depending on how you measure it. That's based on the top 1 million websites in Alexa's data set, which is being discontinued, but the stats look similar to that depending on wherever you slice. And that's just the top 1 million. So that's also excluding huge amounts of the real web of the many, 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 many small sites in the long tail. So WordPress is huge. It is, it's huge, but it's open source, it's very poorly managed, it's very poorly run, so it does a poor job of marketing itself. But if I were to try and describe it, it has become fundamentally the operating system of the web. And that if you are building anything that looks or feels like a website, it's probably one of the best tools to choose. It's probably one of the easiest to access and use. It has the largest readily available marketplace for themes and plugins and filters and stuff, and developers and designers and people who can use it. There are other ways to build websites, there are other platforms and technologies, but really WordPress has become homogenous. And I spend a huge amount of my time looking at websites and being on and discovering websites, and 9 out of every 10 that I visit, if you view the source codes, it says Yoast in there somewhere. So one of the challenges of WordPress is there's a fundamental principle that it does as little as possible. The core heart of WordPress is deliberately quite shallow, so it doesn't ship with anything like a contact form, or there's no inherent security add-on, there's no email infrastructure, there's no marketing tools, there's no SEO. So core WordPress does some very, very basic rudimentary SEO stuff, like it gives you the absolute bare minimum. But if you want to
gives you a title tag.
Yeah, and barely even that, one that you can't differentiate from the name of your post, which is like quite fundamental. I don't necessarily want the same words to appear in both those places. And that's by design, like it's intentionally quite thin. So there is a huge ecosystem of plugins around that if you, I want a contact form, I want a security plugin, I want an SEO solution, and you shop around and pick one out of the masses. For a decade, Yoast has been the biggest SEO plugin by an order of magnitude, by several orders of magnitude, in terms of number of downloads, number of installs, quantity and level of reviews. We are synonymous with WordPress SEM. Because a lot of people who actively want to market their site at some point in their journey will go, okay, I have a site, I have a few pages, I want to do some SEO. Search for SEO, they find us. Really great. We have a freemium product and a model, and then an upsell to a whole bunch of premium add-ons, etc., which unlock more tools and capabilities.
And which do what? Give us some examples just so they understand what you're talking about.
So the free tool does everything that you need in order to compete in Google. And that breaks down into, I think, and this is contentious, but I think it breaks down into roughly 3 categories. So your site has to be discoverable by Google, which is essentially technical standards. Do you have a functioning XML sitemap? Are you outputting the right meta tags? Are you aligning with best practice standards? And again, WordPress doesn't do much of that out of the box, maybe 5% of what you need. We fill in the rest of it. There's a huge amount of heavy lifting there to add that capability on. Then you've got to be indexable. So the content you're writing has to align with various standards and guidelines, and some of that is technical and some of it's editorial. So Google will actively not index and consume and rank pages which are not very good, or which contain very little text, or which don't have certain combinations of meta tags. So some of that we do automatically, some of which we guide you through the process to do. And then you've got to essentially beat your competitors. You've got to have content that's good enough to get cut through. So the rest of what Yoast SEO does is essentially
good in the context of compared to competitors.
Yes.
But from the user's perspective, ideally.
Yes. So a human being has searched for something that your product or service or business has either solves directly or has an opinion on, or has content that helps somebody on a journey. Is that better than the next guy's? Does it fill a gap? Yeah. So that's
user thinks so.
Yeah, and that's the rest of what we try and solve. So we have a whole bunch of content tools which do things like they analyze your content as you write it, and they'll say things like, we noticed that you keep starting paragraphs with the same word, which makes it weird to read. Or we noticed that this section's very long, you should break it up into subheadings. And some of these are explicitly SEO stuff, like you should probably mention your keyword more, because if you're trying to write a page which is a comprehensive guide about cats and you never say cats, it's not going to do very well. And that's not about getting the perfect ratio of keywords or stuffing it everywhere, it's about being on topic. And that Google enforces a model where one page is about one thing, And that requires a kind of subtly different type of writing and content shaping than you might do if you were writing a book or a white paper or something.
So I'm going to have to rename my feline forum.
But then you also want to be mentioning kittens and puppies, maybe a little, depending on where you want to go. So we give you a feedback mechanism for all of that and say, okay, do a bit more of this, do a little bit less of that, have you thought about this, and guide you through that. Some of that is explicitly SEO stuff, but a whole bunch is readability and just like, is this text easy to consume? And there's a whole bunch of there's some contentious feedback on that because it does tend to make people simplify their content. We think that's good. We think that a content that's easier to read, that has short, like we say, use shorter words, use simpler language, write shorter sentences. It's quite hard.
Especially for guys like us.
Yeah, I score really badly when I write stuff with it, and I have to rewrite and rewrite. Okay, there's fewer syllables.
Just have more and more parentheses. Like.
Well, we catch that as well. So it guides you through that in the hopes that if your objective is to get lots of traffic from lots of people, from lots of different places, the more accessible you make that, the wider you're casting a net. And yes, you might have quite an expert topic, it might be quite in depth, but your objective is still going to revolve to a degree around accessing the widest possible audience. So it's quite cool. So that's part of it. We're also starting to expand out into kind of more general content stuff. So we just launched an inclusive language feature, which is really cool, which detects when you're using phrasing that might be offensive. So I won't give any examples because it's going to be offensive. So fallen into a trap. But then we provide recommended alternatives. So we're starting to go broader into not just are you ticking the SEO boxes, but are you genuinely producing content that's good and helpful and useful and inclusive and all this other stuff. So yeah, we're the backbone of SEO in WordPress. And yeah, more recently, Shopify. We January launched a Shopify app that does much of the same thing, slightly different treatment and context because if you're on Shopify, we know your e-commerce. It's a slightly different set of needs, slightly different set of rules, but the core principles are the same.
So you are the first pure play SEO that I've brought on board to speak. So briefly, I wanted to talk about just SEO versus SEM and just kind of, the delta and how you see those things. I did have two other people on, Josh Castell, who did marketing, and another guy, Eli, just came out. I think by the time this comes to air, he'll already be out there, Elijah. But I wanted to get your take. First of all, before we jump into that, what does SEO at Yoast look like? So are you defining the strategy for you're not trying to make Yoast rank?
A little bit. So yeah, it's not my main focus, but I think to a degree we have to dog food. Okay. Nobody is going to buy SEO software from a company that fails fundamentals. And because we're so big and because we're quite opinionated, we paint a bit of our target on our backs. And if and inevitably when we get some stuff wrong, we take a lot of flack for it. So I do spend a little bit of time making sure that we're following our own rules and guidelines.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Getting stuff right. Huh. Yeah, not officially, but it's quite interesting to sniff around that.
Yeah, I bet.
And it's like one of my favorite things about SEO is nobody really truly comprehensively understands how it all works. Not even Google. The black box and degree of machine learning, algorithms within algorithms, feeding other algorithms, nobody really gets it. So there's a degree of, not experimentation, I don't really believe in experimentation in SEO, but there's certainly a degree of constantly iterating and improving and refining and checking, and things change, people tweak things, stuff gets missed all the time in the same way it does with any company. So I chase the website around and have a look. But yeah, that's not the main job.
Okay, so what would your main job be then? Defining new strategies for the
product features and strategy, and which of the many things we should build, and technically how those should work and what they should look like. So in a world without Yoast, most websites would need to go through a process where they said, we need to go and understand all of Google's technical requirements for things like XML sitemaps, canonical URLs, etc., and then develop an implementation for our website which uses our business logic, and that takes a couple of weeks. Fairly straightforward. The challenge we have is running on 14 million websites. We have every possible combination of not only our own software, but a billion different hosting environments, PHP versions, Apaches, Nginx's, SQL, different database formats, sharding, internationalization, nightmares. And then alongside that, WordPress has something like 50,000 plugins in the repository, and there is no dependency management system. So I can write a plugin right now that breaks your plugin. And if I run them both together, my site will throw errors. So we have a huge amount of time making sure that the rules and the code that we're writing and the features we're developing interact nicely with an infinite number of possible combinations. And then there's a theme ecosystem which sits alongside that. So depending on the code that you're using to display your pages and your content, there's further dimensions of potential conflict. So as an individual business saying we should implement canonical tags, fairly straightforward, I've got a 6,000 word document that has to consider every conceivable eventuality and edge case, and then we've got to write code to implement that. So a big part of my job is going over the next 12 months, what are the features we're going to build? How should they work? What's the tech spec? And how do we make this perfect? How do we solve this problem? Which I think is a really enviable position for an SEO to be in, to be not just patching and tweaking for one site, but to be going, how do we fundamentally solve conceptually these types of requirements? And in some cases, that's really tricky because the specs themselves aren't great and they don't scale infinitely. So things like if I've got an international setup, and I need to describe the relationships between all of my different versions of my pages in different languages. That doesn't work when you hit a certain scale, and it doesn't work when you have other dependencies and interactions. So we've got to find workarounds and clever solutions, and some of that is guiding the user to make certain decisions where we don't have any context. Some of it is choosing what not to build and where to draw the line. It's a fascinating challenge.
And 14 million websites. If you mess up, you're going to get some phone calls.
Yeah, which does happen occasionally. And so not only 14 million websites, but as the mechanisms by which we ship our software, we publish an updated version that lands in the WordPress ecosystem, and people either have their sites automatically update, which immediately breaks them, or they go and hit update and they download the latest version. If it's broken, there's no mechanism for them to revert unless they've set one up and they've got a backup system, which many of those websites are small businesses which won't. And the only fix is we've then got to ship another version. So as soon as it's out the door, if there's issues with it, it's a huge problem. And even if we try and revert, they've then got to get the latest package, which if their site's broken, isn't going to work very well. It's an absolute nightmare. So we spend huge amounts of time and resources testing, triple checking, smoke testing in different environments. Our code for our test scripts is typically about 3 times longer than the actual solutions they're having, even for really simple stuff. So yeah, it's pretty huge.
It's funny you say that. Like for a long time, I come from a waterfall product management background, and a lot of people were like, waterfall, that's so old school. Like, I can't believe you still do that, blah, blah, blah. It was at eBay. But eBay was kind of a similar problem. Like if you shipped bad code, you have now directly impacted 150 million items.
And every minute that goes by where that's still broken is...
And it might stay broken for weeks until you get this thing rolled out again and fixed and whatever. So everything was much, much more wired. It was closer to sending a man to the moon than it would be a typical software. Like it's kind of like physically shipping software.
Yeah, we're sending a CD out, essentially.
I mean, almost. If you screw it up, you're not going to be able to help them. They're on their own.
And for the first time, we have competitors now in a way that we've never really had. I won't name them because they're awful and they steal our code and rebrand it and present it as their own and say nasty things about us. But for the first time, there are alternatives, and so if we make a big mistake, we'll slice users straight out, and our market share will drop. So yeah, the care we have to take to make sure that this stuff is infinitely resilient is fascinating.
I bet. Okay, so how would you define SEO and SEM and the difference? I asked Elijah May the same question. I'm kind of curious. I want to make sure that the audience is like really clued in about how an actual professional SEO sees those things. Like if you were a business, which one would you do, or would you do both, or why, or how, or whatever?
Wow, tricky. And yeah, every SEO you ask will give you a different answer on this. So I start with
which is why I think is an interesting question.
Start with SEM because I think that's the easy bit, which is you bid for traffic, which is you access a marketplace not unlike an eBay, and you blind bid for traffic with some degree of intent to a landing page that you've crafted. And depending on the level of competition and the kinds of phrases and intents that you want to target, you're going to pay more or less. That's going to work better or worse. And you can scale that up on demand, or you can turn it off, or you can pivot strategy immediately. Very nice, on demand, good if you're doing short-term strategies, if you're not interested in long-term brand building, if you have something that's time sensitive and you need to crank up the traffic and you know that you've got sufficient throughput that you're going to make enough revenue, etc., great, really good. And almost certainly makes sense to run in parallel with SEO. Because the difference is that none of that applies in SEO. You are, let me take a step back actually. Most brands, and by extension most websites, will to a degree describe the thing that they sell. I am a dentist, I offer dentistry, look at my dental products. It's not interesting, it's not compelling, it's not differentiated. You can run all the SEM you want, and people who want your dental services might find your page and they'll come through and convert. The SEO challenge is I need to be able to reach people 2 months before that point when they go, I have had toothache for 2 days, and they are starting to explore the problem space and they're Googling things. They're not looking for a solution, they're starting to explore the problem space. And to win the SEO game there, you need to have content and reputation sufficient to convince an omniscient AI that your web page is the best possible solution for the problem they're having there and then. Which isn't necessarily going to be, I want to buy dentistry. The best outcome for Google in that scenario, we were talking earlier about, this is Google's audience and Google's users problem. The best outcome for that user is a guide and a video and a resource that helps them self-diagnose, that might say, you know what, you don't need to go to the dentist, maybe you should just floss and then check it in a week or so. Mm-hmm. And SEO is doing that at scale, solving Google's users' problems before they get, possibly also at the point where they're going to spend some money, great, much more competitive, but the real opportunity is much higher up the funnel. So doing that at scale, and then also finding a way to connect that to your commercial engine. So what you might end up doing is at the bottom of that guide say, here's our newsletter, here's our white paper, here's our webinar, learn about teeth. Mm-hmm. That's a strange topic. But yeah, and it's quite an alien way of thinking. Like, you are not trying, like all marketing is grab attention, try and sell. And actually what we're now saying is intercept problems and try and help. And
continue to help.
Yes, and help people who probably will never buy from you. But then you reach 1 million people, and if 0.1% of those go, oh, okay, now I do need to go to the dentist, and I remember that one was really useful, you've built a positive brand association, and yeah, you hope that conventional marketing and advertising rules apply and you capture some kind of value out of that. It's hard. You can try and compete at the thin commercial end, but you are, those kinds of terms are much more competitive because everybody wants the easily converting stuff. It's easier to measure, it's easier to build business cases. There is already a lot of content out there. There are already a lot of websites. So you need to be producing resources which are 10 times better than the best people in the space already, which is a huge ask. And then to also scale that. And again, this is quite an alien way of thinking for businesses. So none of this sits in conventional budget spaces. None of this is well understood.
Yeah, it's not like a physical mailer you used to send out, which a lot of businesses, they totally get that. Like, well, I'll reach 1 million people. I'm sending out 1 million envelopes. Yep. This is like, change some stuff on a website and suddenly 10,000 people will show up. Yeah. It's like, wait, what caused that to happen?
Yeah, and no matter how much you try and test and evaluate and reverse engineer, you will never get to anything close to understanding, okay, I made this red and therefore I got more of it. No, you have no idea, because you don't know what the competitors do, you don't know how the landscape's changed, you don't know what the impact of the weather was, you don't know how the fundamental size and shape of the internet is changing. Maybe Wikipedia did something and that meant that you have no idea and you can't isolate any of those enough.
Literally the weather, we heard one presentation today, literally the weather changed the algorithm, the output, and they spent weeks trying to figure it out. It's like, oh, it turns out it was nice weather in Germany, and that's why we lost a whole bunch of traffic. So that's.
And there's a huge subset of the SEO industry which is obsessed about this kind of testing, and they'll go, I have discovered that if I make this thing blue, I will get more traffic. And we've tested it, and you haven't. You really, none of them have. I think there is no way you ever get to that kind of clarity. We have broad direction. And there's no surprises in there really. Like, again, it's about, is your content helping Google's users to solve Google's users' problems? And incidentally, yes, okay, you can try and upsell off the back of that if you're graceful. Right. There are no magic tactics really, which is a shame.
So I want to talk a little bit about the history, how we got here, because I think this is a pretty interesting long tail of a conversation. So from my background and where I kind of got involved was right after Nuhu got turned into GNUhu, turned into Nuhu, turned into DMOZ. And that's right when I was getting involved in understanding anything about search at all, like which is a long time ago for those who don't know. That was right around the time they were bought by Netscape. So DMOZ's idea was, why don't we just get a whole bunch of people, moderators, who just are really passionate about whatever it is, dogs, dentistry, whatever, and they'll curate as many things in that category as they can. And people who have stuff in that space will go to DMOZ and say, hey, I have a website that's about dogs or dentistry, please put me in your index. Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, then they go there and they go, oh, this is for dentistry in Munich or whatever. It's like, okay, so go to the dentistry, go down to, maybe it's location based, now Munich. Okay, now you have a link there and it's alphabetized or whatever. That was hugely important for companies like Yahoo and eventually Google. They just basically scraped that like crazy.
Yeah, one of the things that definitely Google and Yahoo, in fact Yahoo, had a patent around trust rank quite early on. And the premise was that the number of hops you were in terms of links from an authoritative resource was quite a key indicator as to your trustworthiness. So if I'm linked to directly from DMOZ, I'm probably a legitimate business. If I have to go through 100 steps, I'm probably a shady back alley dentist rather than a legit one. So yeah, DMOZ was huge. And then Google not quite so explicitly used it, but definitely it was part of their consideration.
So there was this time period when there was this concept called LUMP, which was an acronym, stood for the link, and I think it meant how the link structure works, or links to it, I guess is probably it. U would be the URL, like the actual structure of the URL. So did it say the exact match of dogs or whatever? M would be meta tags. Back when meta tags really were a thing. Meta keywords and meta descriptions. And
meta tags are more of a thing than ever, but certainly not meta tags. Not meta keywords, but there's a real resurgence.
Okay, we'll talk about it too. And then P would be placement on the page, where your content is physically falls.
Yep, so because something in the middle is more important than something in the footer, and that's reasonably easy to determine.
And obviously, if something is an H1 tag at the top of the page, that's probably more important than something that's in the middle of the page. So how did we get from LUMP to where we are today?
Because of the kind of challenges that were mentioned around SEO not really fitting anywhere into an organization, because nobody's interested in producing helpful content, they want to be selling stuff, it always existed at the fringes. And it was always exclusively tactical. It was, what tactics can we apply in order to try and rank higher to get more visitors? It was never tried to address the fundamental challenges of how do we make our website better and more helpful. Mm-hmm. So that manifested in SEOs essentially breaking all of the things. And one of the first things that they broke was directories like DMOZ. That there was a realization that if there is some kind of intrinsic value in being listed in these types of directories, great, let's brute force it.
Let's put ourselves in there.
And then let's have agencies that their clients pay them to put them in for them. Let's have services and middleware that do the same thing. Let's scale this until it breaks. And lo and behold, it breaks.
So how did we get from LUMP to, let's say, PageRank or RankBrain?
So, as we were saying just now, one of the challenges that SEO has always had is that it's quite a hard conceptual model. The idea that it doesn't work like other marketing channels. You can't just say, let's put adverts or websites or stuff in front of users and hope that some subset of them convert. So it's never sat anywhere comfortable within organizations. So it's always been extremely tactically focused, certainly back in the older days, maybe less so now. The whole model then was, we have this weird external team who sit over here, which, we'll give you a bit of budget and hopefully you can drive some traffic and wow, the results are amazing. But all of that is driven from essentially tactical hacking of whatever today's opportunity is. And the first big thing that really worked like that was directories like DMOZ, to the point where as soon as it becomes apparent that there is inherent value in being listed in these directories, because Google is looking at them, Yahoo's looking at them, they have some impact on where they decide which sites rank, of course everybody goes, right, everybody put all of the links in all the directories, and services evolve and agencies evolve and links start getting traded and the inherent value increases. And then at some point, Google and Yahoo and everybody else goes, directories are now fundamentally worthless. They have been utterly polluted by SEO tactics to the point where we are going to completely ignore them. And then, like, we live in a world where actually the idea of directories and DMOS would be really interesting. I would really like a human curated service that helps me categorize and explore stuff. They just don't exist anymore because SEO killed it. And then went on to do the same thing with blog comments. So exactly the same thinking. It turns out that if one website links to another, that's a sign of endorsement. Google will spot that. And if it's a bigger website or a popular one, that's a bigger sign of endorsement. It's going to affect where my site ranks. Oh, these sites have blog posts and comment forms. I can go fill out a comment. I can say that I'm from jonosdentistry.com. Great, that's a vote. And again, exactly the same thing unfolds. We do that at scale. All the tactics get rolled out. Agencies evolve, all the spam, and now nobody runs comments anymore. And this has been the pattern for SEO for 15 years or so, that it hops onto the latest tactical thing and it milks it to the point that it dies, and then you hope that you survive enough to do the new thing. And all the agencies rebrand themselves, and today it's digital PR, in 2013 it was infographics, before that it was guest posting, thing after thing. We're finally starting to see the industry evolve and mature now with things like RankBrain, with essentially Google's increasing intelligence, and not the right word, but Google's increasing ability to evaluate the actual quality of the underlying thing, as opposed to just scrape the words and count the inbound links. They're actually doing a much better and better job of saying, is this a good resource? And the closer they get to that, the harder the tactics become. I'm getting to the point where I don't think there are many SEO tactics. I think there is only strategy, and that essentially boils down to have a better website that is more helpful and more useful for more users.
So we used to have a lot of like Viagra spam, like all over the SERPs, search engine results page is what that stands for. And now you really don't see that. That has largely gone away.
Yeah, they've done a phenomenal job of clearing up the bottom 30% or whatever it is of the internet. They've got very, very good at excluding things which are definitely bad. And there's two interesting components to that, I think. One is we're hearing increasingly from them that they are conscious of storage space. So the internet is now very big, there are very many pages, and they are actively choosing much more often to not index things at all. Like, it is not in their interest to create a database of everything on the web when so much of it is Viagra. Right. So they're getting much more nuanced in what they choose to exclude, and the barrier for that is still quite high. Most normal websites and normal pages won't struggle to get into Google. If they are, there's something else going on. But yeah, they've certainly sliced off all the bottom. But in parallel to that, there's some really interesting discussions happening around what's left, and the top 10, 20, 30 results in any competitive industry tend towards being over-optimized. And as you start to click through these and see them, you see the same patterns. You can see that they've hired an SEO agency, they've been given a brief to write 500 words of copy, and they're going to structure it in this way, and they're going to use the keywords just so. Maybe they've used Yoast, for better or worse. And all of these pages are not quite helpful. Like, they are designed and built to be just good enough to outrank their competitors and to be the good enough to be in that spot. But they're always honeypots or lead captures, and they're never really truly helpful. And there are many sectors and industries where the first 2 or 3 pages of Google are just going to be content that's been designed to rank in SEO. And I think where Google are going at the moment is trying to solve that problem, which is there was about 2 weeks ago, we had the helpful content update. It's very rare of them to name updates because they launch thousands a year, but this one was a milestone. And the premise is that those kinds of pages shouldn't rank. And there's an interesting, there's a kind of rebellion. There's a whole bunch of users saying, no, we should abandon Google and we should use Reddit for everything, because that's better in so many ways, right? But like, if you're looking for authentic, truly helpful content, like what the dentistry self-diagnosis thing, Reddit is probably going to be a better result than the first 20 pages of dentist sites, which have generic blurb, which is all just recycled. So there's a kind of this, I think we're almost at the final step of this evolution where SEO truly becomes about, have I produced helpful content that deserves to rank and helps the user, rather than just, have I completed whatever set of tactical requirements I need to outrank my competitors this week before we break whatever the latest trend is.
Yeah. So I like to think of it as, so Google has a product. That product is ads.
Yep.
And SEO is the tool they use to sell those ads.
Yep.
If SEO didn't exist and they didn't give a certain amount of latitude to SEOs to do what they need to do to make things rank better, then there would be no ads. The ads would not make sense. because you'd say, oh, there's nothing, I can't control anything about anything that's going on here, so
there's and there's a huge amount of content that doesn't align well to ads, where it's informative or educational, and you want to get the users in, get them hooked to using and relying on that, and then you can, do the commercial ads alongside that, and then once they've built those behavioral patterns, it just also happens that you're searching for things which have direct commercial outputs and can be easily advertised and converted.
Yeah, I think people largely think of Google as a search engine, but it's really an ad engine.
It's an ad engine, definitely. Yeah, that's where the money lives.
Yeah, and once you understand that, like you and I long ago at another conference had a conversation that always stuck with me. I think we both were circling around the same idea for a while, and then we just both kind of figured it out at the same time in the same place, that maybe there is no way to do SEO anymore. Like maybe the thing is, for those who don't understand, there are so many sub-engines within Google that do tiny little things.
Yeah, algorithms within algorithms.
So you were describing that, but like specifically, let's say something is looking for what your Better Business Bureau report is or whatever, and it suddenly starts using that as a key signal or something. You're just looking at your website, you haven't made any changes at all, and suddenly you're going up or down or whatever. You're like, what is going on? Like how? And also, but they only do that in 3 categories, and you just happen to be in the one. So all these other people who are doing these tests can't see it. And they're like, no, it's not that, because I went up and down in Better Business Bureau and it didn't matter. And so you're sitting there trying to optimize one thing, and it's actually something way over here that's happening. And like, so SEO in the traditional sense that it used to work, where it's lumped, where I have control over all the variables, it literally may not exist at all anymore. And if it still exists, that's great, but it might only be a temporary situation.
Yeah, and I think the model I was describing earlier kind of fits with that the kind of base level of, have I met best practice enough to be eligible to be discovered? Anything beyond that, it's all going to be black box, and it's going to be really hard to understand and manage that. And I think there's a bigger challenge here, which is all businesses forever, of probably all types, have operated on some flavor of MVP and go, what is the minimum viable effort, cost, energy, time that we have to invest in order to get to market, to launch our product, to whatever. Mm-hmm. No business ever gets beyond that, because if you aim for 80%, you inevitably only ever hit 60, and most things are broken and a bit rubbish. SEO requires you to aim for 100% and hit 90. And the one brand that does that will win, and everyone else will lose. Mm-hmm. And just businesses are fundamentally not set up to care about quality. Or like, how many businesses have somebody internally who owns quality? How many businesses even have a concept of quality? And yet that's the requirement. It's never stated quite that explicitly, though I say that. Google has a document that they give to the human quality tester quality rating testing guidelines. They employ 30,000 humans who essentially vet and validate whether their machine learning systems are producing the right kind of results by looking at results. The word quality appears in there 300 times. It's not a word I ever hear SEOs using. Yet if we start to say that the way to win is to produce better, more useful content at scale, etc., the word quality seems to me a lot more sensible and universal than the word SEO. Mm-hmm. And that's increasingly what it's becoming. You can't have a bad website rank very well, unless everyone else in that sector is bad or you're exceptionally good in some way. And that isn't about finding the one magic tactic. It's not about the better bureau results. It's not about updating your copyright. It's about making 1,000 small things better and slightly better than your competitors. But no businesses internally.
And you might stumble upon the right answer by having a good Better Business Bureau report because you have a good website.
Or your competitors might mess something up. Mm-hmm. And you'll never know.
You'll never know.
No. But if you're doing good stuff and you are investing in improving the quality of your website, over time, directionally, you will go up. Mm-hmm. And there's no rocket science there, there's no magic. That happens, and we see evidence of that time and time again. But you will never isolate what it is.
So the SEO of old is really just a collection of strategies that have to be implemented uniformly across your stuff.
Yep.
And it had better be working with really good content to begin with, otherwise forget it.
Yep.
That's pretty much it.
Yeah,
really good lead funnels, which I think is interesting, because that means that a lot of the old school kind of hacker sort of short-term win type stuff, it's kind of almost counterproductive.
It still exists. So I'm firmly in the school of brand building. I think that's more interesting. I think just personally my preference and the world I want to help shape and live in is one populated by brands that are meaningful and helpful and stand for something. The alternative to that is you can fire up 100 domains, spin up a whole bunch of cheap content for Viagra and casinos, rank really well for 2 or 3 days based on some tactical manipulation, and then burn everything. And you can rinse and repeat that to a degree. That does get far harder and far more expensive, and the success rate is far rarer. It is still viable. There are still lots of people who do that, some very successful, very happy people. I think that's less interesting, and I think that will continue to get harder.
It's a harder road, ultimately.
Oh yeah, and for a long time, it's been far harder to do it the evil way than the good way.
Yeah, which is usually it's the other way around.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about more evil stuff in a minute, but you kind of mentioned that there's this thing that's going on in the marketing industry, and it's been going on for a while. I've been watching it basically since the beginning. So I was employee 11 at ValueClick many moons ago. So one of the reasons I decided to leave that company was because I sat right next to the sales team. And they very friendly ladies, and they would make these phone calls like, oh, how much inventory do you want to buy or whatever. And they would tell them, you should have like really beautiful ads, like make it really engaging, really beautiful ads. And I was sitting there thinking about it, and I'm like, actually, if it's like Nike or whatever, they should have the ugliest ad you could possibly imagine, because that means fewer people are going to click through. And ValueClick's model was a pay-per-click model. And so you want, from your brand's perspective, you don't even want
all the brand exposure but no clicks.
Right, all the brand exposure, no clicks. And I'm like, they're literally giving them the exact wrong advice. And that's kind of when I sort of had this tingling. I'm a pretty ethical person, and I'm like, I just don't think that's going to work for me. I can see the writing on the wall for me. Once I start feeling like I am contributing to the problem, it's a much harder thing for me to stomach. And eventually they got bought by DoubleClick, and DoubleClick got partially by Google. And so a lot of my old code is now inside Google. So I actually have a pretty good insight on how that all works. And then the other thing is I was in part of another company as an advisor, first company I ever advised, a company called Adometry. And their whole business model was consuming logs from companies doing advertising, analyze it, and see how much fraud they thought was going through the system. And it turns out it's an enormous amount of fraud, like an enormous amount. And they were eventually bought by Google and shut down effectively, which is fairly telling about where Google is.
Yeah, as you say, ads is their product, and we all know anecdotally that a huge number of the clicks on both sides, both on the kind of AdSense side and people's inventory and going through Google, we know that a huge amount of that is bots. Mm-hmm. But it's a very tactical line that Google has to walk, how much they want to police that, how much they want to talk about it, how much they want to admit that, this is a bigger problem than Google, right? There are a lot of bots on the web, and it is in various people's commercial interests to cheat this.
Yeah, and so there was a fellow I met who was willing to give me his logs, and he ran a fairly large ad network. I was trying to do some analysis on the likelihood that someone was ever going to click on do not track within different browsers. Nice. Extremely rare thing for anyone to actually go through the process of doing it. Yeah.
Extremely frustrated they deprecated it, because it would have been quite a handy tool.
It would have been great, but they knew full well it wasn't going to work.
Far too cumbersome.
Because there was no good controls, and it doesn't do anything.
And nobody respected it.
And nobody respected it.
I might be the only human who's ever implemented it in Google Tag Manager to control analytics. Like, nobody bothers.
But the reason I thought it was interesting is in some browsers, you had to click like 3 times to turn it on. In Google, you had to click like 7 times to turn it on. So they're intentionally making it very difficult. And so there had been some research paper long ago that basically said it was like an order of magnitude less for every click you had to go down to turn on or off every feature. So effectively, from a UI perspective, you should hide any features that are very unlikely that anyone's ever going to need. So I was going to do the analysis to see if that's in fact what happened. If the companies that made it more prominent or more likely to see it than the companies that made it less prominent. So anyway, I got access to this guy's logs, and I was dumping this one header, the do not track header, and the user agents to figure out which ones were correlated. And for whatever reason, Internet Explorer was off the charts. It was like 10+%.
Interesting.
Which is impossible. Yeah. I mean, it's still, I forget what it was now, like 5 clicks or something. Literally impossible. There's just no way millions of people have gone down those 5 clicks. Zero chance that is true. And I'm just looking at these logs. I'm like, this can't be right. It can't be right. There's just no way this is true. And it suddenly dawned on me, that's just how many robots that I just detected. 10%.
Because of course they all use IE.
Right. They use IE because they just want to blend in and pretend these are robots, and they just grabbed a user agent, and that's the one they're using. And that was just one robot that I detected. Now imagine how many more as a percentage I didn't detect using that one technique. And it's probably, I'm going to guess here, but 20, 50% of the traffic they were seeing was robotic. And now you extrapolate that to Google and conversations that they've had. They're like, well, odometry says that we're having this much, we only have about 5-10% fraud. And one of the mega companies involved basically said, are you kidding me? Because that means that my traffic represents all the fraud on all of the internet. I think you are wildly misunderstanding how much traffic is fraud. So the heart of my question, that's just all background, and my question is, it seems like there's some sort of moral bankruptcy going on here. Like, everyone knows that this is messed up who's bothered to measure it, including the people who run these things, including people like me who used to work there. What's going on? Like, what is this purely just, there's just too much money to say no at this point?
I think we are, but also I think we are, I don't think we have a better option. I think we are tied to most of the commercial internet being based on on both sides, most of the commercial internet being tied to per-click advertising mechanisms. So whether that's Google Ads directly in there or banners on people's sites. And no matter how hard we try, we can't seem to find an alternative to that. And the challenge of that model is one of scale and management and micromanagement. So of course you end up with intermediaries and ad networks and fourth parties and exchanges and ads being handed off to different systems. And then that is all invisible because no brand, no company, no marketing manager is ever going to go with brand and manually establish and manage and maintain relationships with different websites, with different platforms, vet all of the individual domains their ads are going to show on. It's a numbers game. I want this banner in front of 10 million people in the hopes that I get 1% of them to click through. And it's wildly inefficient. And it is still a Wild West. It's cowboys and it's almost completely invisible. Nobody has come up with a better option. Micropayments as a mechanism has failed, subscriptions as a mechanism has failed, direct partnerships doesn't scale and has failed. We don't have an alternative for how the commercial web should work. And still nobody comes up with one, so it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then SEO is getting harder and harder, so there's more money being plowed into that. And analytics is getting harder and harder, so there's more money getting plowed into it. It gets more and more anonymous. Browsers themselves are now baking in more privacy controls, like Firefox stripping out Facebook's tracking URLs. That's going to put more money into ads because it's harder and harder to prove that stuff's working, so you go broader. Now I need my advert in front of 10 million people in the hopes that I get 0.1%. And it just becomes more and more homogenous and these systems get bigger and bigger. We don't have another way of doing it. It's horrible.
It is. So let's talk about the Google antitrust lawsuits. So you and I know a number of people who've been asked to go present against Google in these various different cases. They've lost some cases like in the European Union. So if anyone's curious about Google's ethics, it's proven in court. This is not up for debate at this point. What do you think is going on? What do you think Google is doing that's anti-competitive?
I think there is definitely a strong argument that they prevent innovation from potential competitors. There is no way that today anybody new will enter the maps space or the flight space. It's just, there's no point. You can't compete with Google's products. And the crux of the argument around that is, are they using their monopoly or monopoly-like scale to unfairly promote their own properties in place of where a competitor might be? That's part of the challenge. If I build a flight comparison site, Google will continue to promote their Google Flights in the first spot. It's a really great service. As a user, I love it, but I kind of like the idea that somebody else might be able to try and build something better, or at least different. And that market's now completely closed off. And there are 100 variations of that story. There are spaces where you just can't compete.
It's the great scrape and replace.
So there's that as well. So so also there are spaces where I know that if I start something, they will just steamroll me, because I will build a proof of concept that Google will look at and say, okay, we can do this better. If Google Flights didn't exist today and I built Hipmunk, which is exactly what happened, Google can just look and say, okay, this is a space that we can work in, we'll just roll out our own thing. And we're in a position where I want to build a healthcare startup. I want to build an e-bike delivery service. I want to build a dentist on-demand service. Tomorrow, there is a reasonable chance that Google will launch its own version. I can't take any story to a VC and say, I'm going to build X, and they're going to say, have you considered that Google's a threat? There is no answer to that. Because, they are a universal threat against any sector. I'm really conflicted because as an end user, this is great for me. And I think there are some phenomenally powerful and positive network effects. Things like so Google are in the driverless car space through, what's the name of that company?
I think they just sold that though.
Oh, okay. Well, let's pretend they didn't for a second. But so they're in the driverless car space, and let's assume that they win because they're Google and they'll leverage their monopoly-like status to crowd out the competitors. You've got a whole bunch of driverless cars driving around urban spaces that also happen to be acting now as Google's mapping system, which also then happen to increase the accuracy of Google Maps listing of businesses opening hours. And if I was going to go to the bakery to get a croissant and Google now knows that they're closed, that is an incredible network effect that is so really, really useful as an end user. Mm-hmm. But the amount of space that closes out and prevents businesses competing across multiple sectors and just reinforces their monopoly power is really, really scary. And I think that's a big part of what the various EU and US efforts are going to try and do, is try and break those entities up. I don't think that even helps. I don't know what that means. I don't think breaking it up technically is really, really complex. And even if these businesses are different entities that don't share data, they're so big and they're so unanimous, and it's not really going to help. And then to your point about the scrape and replace, this is now hitting the content side, which isn't just flights or different verticals. This is all content on the web. So as a content producer, writing content in order to try and help Google's users in Google and solve these problems and have all these great dentistry guides, I produce in-depth articles that I research, that I employ experts for, that I produce media for, that I keep up to date, that I really invest time and energy and money into. I hope that I rank and I hope that I get a couple of clicks, but maybe not. Maybe I get pushed out by Google's own dental service, but let's say I'm fighting to survive at the bottom. And then the next thing that happens is Google scrapes that content from my page and they just show it directly in the search results. So that a user who's searching, hey, I've got toothache, just sees a paragraph at the top of the page that summarizes my text. Maybe it doesn't even replace it verbatim, maybe it just summarizes it. Maybe I get a little attribution link in a very faint gray color, maybe not. And now users, great, problem solved. Google's amazing, they've solved all my problems. As a content producer and a business, I have lost my commercial incentive to produce the content that Google used. And there's some... And
they used to penalize people for doing exactly this
Yeah,
thing.
They have documentation saying don't do this. Phenomenal. That's a rabbit hole. So this is really tricky. And there isn't an answer to this. And I think the SEO industry is focusing in the wrong place at the moment. All of the focus, we had it this morning in some of the sessions, all the focus at the moment is on this concept of zero-click searches, which is there are various studies that show there is an increasing proportion of people who go to Google, type something, and then don't click anything. The inference is that they saw something like the rich snippet, the paragraph at the top, and they didn't need to visit the underlying site.
Right. They were trying to do math or something. They got the answer. They don't need to go
to the toothache issue.
They don't need to go to calculator.com or whatever to do the math.
Google can provide a frictionless user experience, and they can eat up whatever business model.
Right.
This is more and more of search, and this is a direction of travel. This isn't done. More and more of the experiences that Google want to offer are solutions in Google, not to ship you off to some other website. And the SEO industry, because it's always been fringe, and because it's always been tactical, and because quality isn't owned by anybody, is built measured and managed quite rudimentarily. Like, it's all based on clicks. How many clicks did we get from Google based on our rankings, and how did they convert? But how many clicks did we get? And suddenly clicks aren't a thing anymore. And the entire industry is focused on how do we get our clicks back? How do we get our users back? They were never your users, they were Google's. We just kind of rented them for a bit whilst it was easier for Google to do that. Nobody is talking about how do we build business models which still thrive in a world where we're not reliant on getting clicks from Google? It's hard. I don't know what the answer is. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Again, micropayments have failed, subscriptions have failed. I don't think there is necessarily an answer, but that's the conversation that I think we need to be having, because this has only got, even if Google gets broken up, even if all these lawsuits happen and they start to pull apart things like Google Flights, there is still an underlying problem that Google don't really necessarily want to send users to other websites. It's not in their best interest. And there's a conflict right at the heart of the model there, and that's not going to go away regardless of what happens legally.
Yeah, so that's perfect segue. So I talked a little bit about with Elijah, the very last episode. So the very top, especially like more contentious things like hotels in Atlanta or whatever, you're not even going to see a single search result for the first half of the page.
Yeah, and there's I don't know if that's necessarily a problem. I think there are many types of searches where the best type of result is not going to be a link to a web page. It's going to be a map and some options and a calculator and a tool, etc. But yeah, from a conventional SEO standpoint, where I used to rank first at the top of the page, I might still rank first, but I might be 30 miles down the screen.
Yeah, I mean, you're so far down, literally no one will even see it.
And that also comes with some really interesting challenges around reporting and accountability and strategy, because all of my forecasting no longer makes sense. The concepts we share and the language we use no longer makes sense. If I'm saying to my C-suite, yes, we rank first for this, there's a very different understanding of what that means. The tools themselves...
You do rank first.
Yeah, great, but nobody's ever seen us. The tools themselves all have different models for this. So things like... Google Search Console, which is their own model for collecting and giving you some reporting, counts individual listings in the horizontal carousels. So I might rank 6th, but that might mean that I'm an off-screen panel in a carousel that I have to scroll across to get to. So none of this makes any sense anymore, which funnels loads more money into adverts and AdWords, which maybe isn't a coincidence, but...
It seems like it's the measurement should either be just visibility or not. We have it or we don't. Or maybe like a number of pixels.
I really like something like column inches, like we have in traditional. You own 13% of this page. Right. Great.
And that makes a lot of sense. That's a great way to measure it. But what I think was happening is the SEOs are just not even on the page anymore. They're below the fold. You have to scroll to get to where there's content.
There's a deeper challenge there as well, which I'm sure we'll hear about at the conference. There's a few people in this space around. What does that ranking even mean? Because we are sat 3 feet apart. We probably get different rankings. We have different search histories. I'm logged in on my phone and different devices, etc. And a whole bunch of other factors.
If you're in private mode or not in private mode.
And which country I'm in, which my browser language settings. You're probably ENUS, I'm ENGB, if I've remembered to change it. All of these are going to affect individual rankings for individual keywords over time. It's going to change whether I've searched before. All of this is fluid. It's really, really hard to make any of this accountable. And then Google will sweep in, extract all your content, all of your clicks disappear. And I'm sat here saying SEO strategy is all about investing in quality and making your business better. How on earth do you build that business case?
How do you do that? Because now you're so far down the fold. I'm just getting the sensation that Google just won, where you have to have SEM, you have to buy ads, or you're just done. I mean, it's a very weird world we've just entered, the brave new world here.
It is, and I think the broader pattern, the way I like to see this is what's happening is that there are many sectors and many types of queries which are solved. You said calculators. There is no incentive for anybody to build a website that helps you with basic math problems now, because Google will solve the calculator thing in line. There are more and more types of searches where the problem is solved. And suddenly we've gone from a paradigm where Google really wanted and needed websites to produce content to fill its inventory. Its inventory is now full. It doesn't. There is no need for anybody to ever write a lasagna recipe ever again. They have every permutation, and they have enough which are as close to perfect as to make near damn no difference. And the world really hasn't noticed, and we're still all trying to compete and churn and put our versions of all this stuff into the space. These are closed systems now. There's no way to get in. And any of these spaces where you can't, the ranking first is all the way down here. Having better content isn't going to help. Trying to do conventional SEO isn't going to help. You have to change your business model. You have to move your location so that you're in a better space on the map. You have to have a licensing fee to get your information fed into Google Flights. These are different ecosystems. And really, the whole game has changed, definitely.
All right. So we agree on basically every single thing we just talked about. Now, here's where I think we might start disagreeing.
Contentious territory.
AMP.
Yeah.
This is the one area I ever remember having an argument with you about.
Yeah. So I'm the pariah. The whole SEO industry hates AMP, and I remain convinced that it is was. Maybe we'll come on to that.
Okay. All right. That sounds interesting then. Okay. So before we get that, let's describe what it is, though, because I ask people all the time, have you heard of this? And everyone universally says no. So.
One of the things Google consistently does very, very badly is marketing and product launches.
That's funny that they're in that business.
Google Wave, Google Search, the AMP was the latest. So let's start at the beginning. Most websites are bad and most websites are slow. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that around education and resourcing and prioritization and business models, but largely speaking, that's the general state of things is pretty poor. The mobile web in particular is very bad because there have been various ways to build mobile sites and various best practices and standards over the years, and most websites have got caught up somewhere between 2 or 3 of those iterations, and they have mobile subdomains and sites that don't load properly on different devices, etc. And in particular, the mobile web is extremely slow, and even slower and worse in emerging markets and developing countries where there is lots of potential ad money to be spent, coincidence. So Google's solution to this was initially to spend 10 years to tell us all it was the year of the mobile and we should sort ourselves out and build better sites, which just didn't happen. There is not enough education, there's not enough incentive, there's not enough motivations for them, for whatever reasons.
It takes time.
Yes, this stuff is hard, and this was a key part of the problem. So the solution was to launch a product, an idea called AMP, which was initially accelerated mobile pages. And the premise was, what if we could give you a opinionated subset of HTML, which was inherently always fast. And a big part of how it would do that would be by preventing you from doing quote unquote bad things. So a large part of why the mobile web in particular is slow is because this page loads 5 megabytes of JavaScript, and these images are huge and uncompressed, and you're doing a whole bunch of weird things with cookie pop-ups.
Like in frames and
frames. Frames are fun. Yeah, and you've got ad networks pulling ad networks, etc. Mm-hmm. So the premise of AMP was, what if you could build a lightweight version of your pages? We make it super easy to build that. We codify what good looks like. We are very opinionated on what bad looks like, and we don't let you do any of the bad things. And rather than have a crappy, shitty, slow thing, you have a great thing. But it was fraught with challenges, both technically and politically. So it was extremely limited when they launched it. It was very, very hard to brand things with it, and you had to build an entirely separate version of your pages in an AMP template. And if you're saying the part of the challenge of the reason that the mobile web is slow is this stuff's hard and complicated, requiring people to build another templating system, probably not the most sensible approach. And they also did what they do badly with every product release, was they do it iteratively. They start off with a product which is so far sub-MVP, everyone gets very excited about the concept, gets very annoyed about the actuality, and then abandons, which is exactly what happened here. So the initial versions of it were far too early. You were very limited in what you could do with branding. There were some very, very major limitations in how you could use and deploy adverts, which obviously is quite a key component of how many sites monetize. And there were some weird technical decisions which looked on the surface like political decisions, but I'm pretty convinced weren't, like all of your pages would be cached in Google's own cache. And there was no way to...
I feel like that was intentional.
It was partly a technical constraint due to how cross-domain, obviously your area of expertise, how cross-domain requests and management work, that there was no mechanism by which they could cache your content and then serve it on the right domain. So they invented a whole new concept, which many people come across now, have signed exchanges. A lot of the new emerging stuff around performance has come out of AMP. Come on to that in a minute, maybe. You had to have all of your content served from Google's cache, and yet simultaneously the controls for managing that were horrendously poor. Again, they just launched a bad product too early. So there was no way to purge the cache. So if you were caching e-commerce pages and your product went out of stock, your price changed, or you had some legal requirements, you can't touch Google stuff. And there's a whole bunch of other mess around that. But essentially they launched it badly technically and politically.
and you inject the wrong character and the whole thing breaks.
Yeah, it was super, super sensitive. So yeah, on one hand, they're building Chromium, which is phenomenally forgiving. I can put the world's most invalid HTML in, create a soup, and it will do a reasonable job of working out what I meant. Yeah, AMP, you go, okay, somebody has accidentally put an ampersand in the wrong place, and you just get an error page, and there's no way to recover from that. And then you also needed to manage the relationships between your pages and your AMP pages in the same way you might do with other SEO stuff like internationalization. Everyone got it wrong. Everyone did a bad job. You also had to load the AMP JavaScript library cross-domain from Google's data centers, which is an interesting political and legal requirement. Again, all of this was just bad product design. So I still quite firmly believe it is a good product, or had good intents to be a good product. I don't think people can make and maintain fast, high-quality websites. I think the motivations aren't.
Okay, so here's where we start diverging, because up to this point, I agree. But there was an assumption that they're going to do a better job, because they were actually de-ranking people who had potentially even faster, better working sites.
So this is, there's a whole bunch of quasi-legal stuff around this written by a bunch of people in Texas who had a vendetta against Google. And I've been through all of this, and a lot of it is spurious. There's some interesting stuff in there. So yeah, Google, for trending news topics in particular and a bunch of other areas, Google has a top stories carousel, which is the horizontal swipey thing for emerging news. And if you wanted to be in that, your page had to be on AMP, which was widely perceived as a tax on the news industry. And there is nobody who hates doing what Google tell them more than the news industry. Like, they already have a very contentious relationship with Google. None of those people are friends, and they see Google as the enemy. And then Google said...
They're right to think that.
Maybe.
I think they are.
Perhaps. I think they would prefer a world where Google is subservient to them, and they dislike that that's not the case.
Yeah, agreed.
So yeah, if you wanted to be in that, you had to be on AMP, and there's no two ways around that. The intentions behind that were, the intentions behind that were never to create that as a barrier to entry. It was that the mechanisms for determining what a fast, high-quality page were did not exist. And it's only as a result of the AMP project and the evolution of the core vitals metrics which came out of that that's now universal, and that requirement's gone away. It was a really bad product decision to roll that out before that ecosystem had evolved. Again, so much of this is just Google being really shit at product. And all of what looks like political maneuvering and coincidental evil just feels like bad product management on their side. It's really quite shocking. So yeah, it's hard.
Well, there's other things along those lines. Like, you could only use Google Ads, for instance. You could use their competitors' ads.
Yeah, and again, just bad product because they launched it too soon, and since they've added support for others. But because, again, the core premise of this is you can't load things in a way that's slow. Google Ads was quite fast to be, okay, now we're compatible, but it turns out that all these other networks need to fundamentally rewrite how they work in order to be fast. So yeah, you can only use the fast ads, and it just so happens that Google is the only one who has a marketplace for the fast ads.
Surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel like that's more than a coincidence, because there's a lot of coincidences here.
There are, but I still think this stuff is good, or at least this stuff can be useful.
Okay, one other quick point. I want you to finish. I just want to make sure we get all the bad stuff out. So how to see this, if you want to do this at home, is go to desktop, search for CNN and Trump.
Yep.
CNN Trump.
Yep.
Okay, then do the exact same search on mobile, and what you're going to see is a carousel, this little swipey thing. And you might see something about Trump on CNN, and you might see another thing, and then you're going to see Breitbart, and then you're going to see, NBC or whatever.
Yep.
So you specifically said where you wanted to go and what you wanted to see, and now Google will serve you up something completely different in the exact opposite direction.
Yeah, there was a really weird moment where they started allowing you to swipe between stories from within it, which, that was nefarious. And that, from what I can tell, there's a whole bunch of competing interests.
That's just devaluing the entire news industry.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I wonder if that was an early attempt to do something like Google Discover before that got enough traction. Like the idea that we want to keep you within Google's ecosystem, swipe through and read other stuff, was a terrible plan. Really, really bad. The other really evil thing that they accidentally did was one of the key advantages of adopting AMP and being compliant was they can preload and pre-render your site so that as I click on my search result, it loads instantly, or at least appears to, because it's preloaded in the background. And they could only do that because of the way that AMP worked and because of the way the caching system worked, and specifically the relationships between the different domains. And yeah, again, this looks evil. This looks like an advantage you're exclusively giving above other sites to the people who happen to use your preferred tech stack. Mm-hmm. And all of these questions come down to, this is a product of the way this thing works, and the only way it can work is that unfair. And all of the news industry's gripes against this thing are, you unfairly rewarded your own technology over all of us who are doing the bad things. Please let us do the bad things and also get the rewards. Tricky.
So this also reminds me a lot of how they treat Chrome. It's like, Chrome is a thing anyone can have. There it is. Yep. It's open source. There you go. Have it. It's Chromium. Just download it. You can do whatever you want. But they won't give you the most critical components. They won't give you the ability to, I don't know, update it. Might be useful if you're launching a browser. Yeah. And so you're thinking, oh, that's okay. That's a relatively easy thing to build. Well, it isn't, though, because now you got to somehow get all of the bugs that they're producing. You got to correlate them, put it on, test all of them, and they're already 6 months ahead of you to begin with, because they have product that they're launching,
so
and you want to be in parity with their product. And now you're getting these bugs, and you're having to backfill them, and you're never going to be anywhere near where they are. So yes, it's technically open source, but you're never, ever, ever going to be able to use it.
We have the same problem with WordPress, that it's open source, and if you don't like the way the leadership and the politics and the marketing work, go and fork it and build your own version, except try and build a community and maintain parity and keep it's just not viable. It's open source, but it's too big to fail.
So why do you like AMP? What's great about it?
It makes fast sites in a way that I don't think practically people can do in the world. So I can handcraft a site from scratch and it will be lightning bloody fast without using AMP. Sure. But real businesses in the real world just can't. And the bigger they get and the more complexity they add, it just becomes impossible. And so
why not just have Google say, I want a fast loading site? That's it. If it's speed and it can't, scroll off to the left or do something stupid on mobile.
They already say that, and they have for a decade, or at least around
they
that.
Say
and
that.
What AMP does different. So AMP is now, it's come through a couple of iterations, essentially just a JavaScript library. It's no different from a React or a jQuery or whatever. The thing that makes it different is opinion, and that it says you cannot load a video and have it autoplay. You have to do lazy loading and do a facade cover over it, and a whole bunch of other rules. And it is only those constraints and enforcing them that enables people to build fast sites, because they don't know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. I did a conference talk last summer with 120 slides of how to put an image tag on a web page. Because it turns out that even the most kind of simple, how do I build a reasonably not shit website, there is a phenomenal amount of depth and complexity in the modern web, and people just don't know. And most developers and most companies will never get past slow, because it gets harder and harder, and there are more moving parts, and they're all running 20 different ad networks, and they're all auto-loading video, and images are complex, and fonts are slow. People can't get it right. And it is only by enforcing a set of constraints that they can. And now the constraints are evil, because who are you to tell me that I can't auto-load a video on my site? Well, if you can auto-load it, but it won't be fast, and it won't be compliant, and you won't be eligible for the pre-caching and stuff because of the way it works. I think a lot of the bad stuff's been fixed. You can now self-host, you can now opt out of the cache. The repository itself is owned by the OpenJS Foundation, and they're going to move the files off Google servers. There's all the components are readily available independently. It's a much better thing, but they did such a bad job with the product launch and the marketing and the management of it. The name is utterly toxic. Mm-hmm. They tried to rebrand, so they launched Bento last year, which was what if we give you just the components? So you want to put a carousel or an image on, just take this, use our JavaScript library, we'll pretend it's not AMP even though it's the same thing. Again, so badly launched and so badly marketed that it's just failed. It makes me really sad, I think. So I got involved quite early on as part of the advisory committee in an attempt to work out what the hell was going on in all of this and to maybe steer it a little bit. That's dried up. It's gone really quiet. I think a lot of the key people who were working on it at Google have left as part of a bigger exodus. So all the performance people at Google have gone to Shopify. Mm-hmm. Quite interesting. And it's just now essentially abandonware. Hopefully it'll get a kick and an initiative once it moves properly into the OpenJS Foundation. I don't know. I think it'll get quietly retired. A lot of what it's done is now just part of Chrome, the Core Web Vitals. The signed exchanges stuff is really, really cool. The signed exchanges stuff solved all of the pre-caching, preloading, cross-domain stuff that you had to be in AMP for. Now you can do that yourself. It's inordinately complex, but you can. I don't know if it's needed anymore. Like some of the early strategic discussions we had in the group were, if this is toxic and it's too late to salvage, maybe we can reinvent it a bit to be Chrome Nightly. Maybe we can make this an experimental tool that edges all the new cutting edge evolving tech. And it was that for a while, and now maybe it's done its job.
Or just get it installed somehow into WordPress, and now you've got 43% of the web.
It just so happens that some of the other people on the advisory committee happen to be part of Automatic. We did look at that. Like WordPress has just moved to a block-based system of building pages, like blocks, components, Bento. Maybe this is all a bit too complex. But I think if I were a small to medium-sized business who didn't have expert developers and who wanted to actively compete in SEO, didn't want to spend 200,000 euros building a mostly static brochureware site, AMP would be absolutely the right way to go, still.
All right, speaking of more drama on the Google side, let's talk about negative SEO. One of my favorites, yours too, I know. We've had long conversations about this. We can stop arguing. So as recently as this trip, I was talking to someone, a former Google employee, and he told me that he indeed tried to start measuring negative SEO internally and like what that might look like and create custom reports, and it got zero traction internally. And I'm shocked to hear that. So what negative SEO is, for those who are not initiated, would you please?
So we've talked about links as a voting mechanism. If one site links to another, that is a vote of endorsement, and at scale that hugely influences where my site ranks. It arguably might be the most important fact. Like the quality and quantity, which is an interesting word, of your link profile is going to significantly influence where you rank versus your competitors. We know that Google count and look at and evaluate the strength of a link based on factors like how popular is this domain. We also know that they look at the broader context of a link, like what is the text that is linked, what is the text around that, what is that page about, how reputable is this site. And those things definitely have an impact on your performance. Therefore, the inverse is potentially true. And Google insist there is no such thing as SEO. And even when they kind of acknowledge that there might be, they say almost nobody needs to worry about this. However, they provide, or at least have historically provided, a tool in Google Search Console which lets you explicitly disavow links from other websites, which would imply that if certain types of other websites do link to you, that could be problematic and might be the kind of thing you want to manage. And if, say, 10,000 Viagra sites started linking to my dentist site tomorrow, I definitely don't want to be ranking for Viagra. Yet we see anecdotally evidence that this kind of thing could, does potentially impact rankings. And quite often it's much more nuanced than just, I will throw thousands of spam links at your site. Quite often it's, if we know that Google is looking at context and they're trying to evaluate what pages and websites are about, maybe I can subtly shift that in a little bit of a direction. Maybe we can make it think that your cat blog is about dogs, and not quite to that extreme, but you can steer. They insist it's not a thing. It definitely is.
Well, just taking it back a step. So let's say I go over to some business and I literally drop a bomb on it or something. It just destroys, and the data is all gone. They were serving on a local machine, and Google can no longer find it because it is literally in flames. They might drop out of the search engine pretty quick. And if they were above me and they're no longer there, where do I go?
So it's definitely in your interest to go and bomb all of your competitors.
So yes, I highly recommend bombing all your competitors.
SEO strategy 101. Warfare.
Literal war. And so if that's possible, it might be possible that there's less crazy things you could do that might have similar effects.
So conventionally we're talking about, like, can I send some nasty links to somebody? But if you zoom out a bit and you start to think about manipulating businesses and people and social engineering, there are definitely things you can do to downrank your competitors or uprank you. It's a pretty nasty space.
It's incredibly nasty.
And
they really truly seem to, some like this engineer that used to work there, obviously know it's real. They're here. I mean, it's not like, it's like trying to disavow air or something. I can't see it, so it's not there. What are you talking about? But we know that they're not even looking anymore. And how we know this is there was a letter written to another SEO who used to come to this conference, where he basically said, hey, I believe there's some negative SEO going on in this thing. There's nothing else wrong with the domain that I can find. Can you please take a look and see if there's anything you can see? And one of the head quality guys over at Google, he said, I've checked the systems and you don't have a manual penalty, you don't have a programmatic penalty, so it's probably a problem with your site. I recommend going and checking these 5 things. And then there was below that, there was an up arrow that said, this is the block of text that I send to people when I have in the hundreds of times checked on this thing. I'm no longer doing this, just go check it yourself or whatever. So there are tools. The tools are not set up to work properly, and they do not find a negative SEO ever by his own determination, and therefore he doesn't bother to check them at all.
There's another really interesting interaction here, which is that we know that there are scenarios and complexities where Google gets things wrong in the interplay between canonical URL tags and different types of redirects with different HTTP statuses and different multi-domain stuff and too many hops and the wrong status. We know they make mistakes. And we know that there are scenarios like if I have the wrong redirect pointing to the wrong domain with the wrong thing, they will index the wrong page, or they will index the right page and they'll put the wrong URL on this. And we see all these, like, certainly at scale for bigger or complex websites. And knowing that, maybe I can tactically point this here in the right way and Google will confuse something, invert it, and oh look, now my brand names in your listing. And there are definitely lots of little edge cases where you can play with this. They shut them quite quickly, I think, when they see them. They definitely have a whack-a-mole capability for a given site or a given domain where they can go in and tweak this. But they continue to say this just isn't a thing.
So my theory is they truly don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, it's so abstract.
It's so impossible. There's so many different ways to do negative SEO. It's sort of negative SEO is to Google as Google is to SEO, in that they are so overwhelmed by the possibilities of negative SEO, they can't even, from their perspective, it is an insurmountable problem from the people I can reach who actually have a clue about what's going on. Whereas SEO is so insurmountable. What are they going to do? Just try to do your best and hope it all works out. But I think negative SEO is it unfortunately is that freight train that is coming, that the more SEOs who figure out that this is a thing they can do. Yes, I can't do traditional SEO. I can't.
Yeah, it's hard to rank higher, but maybe it's easier to knock down
everybody else. Yeah. That's
scary.
Yeah, right?
And so much of that, and traditionally SEO falls into like either I'm black hat and I'm breaking Google's rules and I'm manipulating stuff, or I'm white hat and I'm one of the good guys. But there's always been, the next step is into the kind of, okay, now I'm doing stuff that's illegal. And even like a lot of the black hat stuff is still, it might be unethical, but it's rarely illegal. But when you start getting into, okay, now can I socially engineer my competitors to make sure that they fail to renew their domain so that I can drop catch it, and we start to cross interesting lines, and that definitely happens in the real world.
So how would you say Google is viewed amongst your peers? Like, I remember asking this question many years ago, maybe a decade or more ago, to some of the SEOs who used to come, and their opinion was, if you could get rid of Google today, you would. In favor of Bing or whatever. I don't even think Bing existed back then. But what do you think their opinion is now? Like, is this a love-hate relationship, or what's sort of the mood amongst your peers?
I struggle with this because the SEO industry itself has fragmented somewhat. I think now, once upon again, like it was all, let's find some tactical linking opportunities. There are now maybe three distinct types of SEO. So there are the tech SEOs who are very interested in XML sitemaps and canonicals and joining up all of that. And maybe some of those are good and maybe some are bad. Maybe some of them are doing manipulative, dodgy stuff. There is the content people who are like we write blog posts, we do informative guides, etc. And increasingly the largest part of the industry is now just digital PR, which is we want to get links, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't look like we're getting links. So we are going to produce a spurious piece of research and hound a bunch of journalists to try and get coverage for it. And it will look like authoritative resources like The Guardian are linking to us because we're a great brand, but actually it's because we did some tedious research. I think they would all give you a different answer. I think the digital PR scenes certainly see Google as a very lucrative resource. And there is a phenomenal amount of money in agencies and to a lesser degree independents producing that kind of research and collateral for their clients who would otherwise struggle to rank. And I think this is an interesting kind of fusion of the SEM versus SEO. Well, this is candy, sugar rush, spiky SEO in a way that's never really existed before. I'm going to spend 20,000 euros to produce some kind of infographic-y, interactive, researchy thing that I will have a reasonable chance to get picked up by a bunch of newsletters, and my traffic will spike for 3 weeks, and then I'll run another one. So they are loving it. They're like a huge explosion of like the PR space. That they very much see Google as a cash cow. I think everyone else still sees them as a bit of an enemy. They are not. They're playing better than they ever have before. Their documentation and their interactions get better, but they still see us as the enemy. I don't think they like SEO. I don't think they really want to acknowledge that they are reliant on it, despite increasingly becoming so. And again, to like the point that the index is now increasingly complete. They don't need us as much, and they're starting to go cold again. I think it's a bizarre relationship where we've never been friends, but we kind of mutually need each other. But that's changing again. It'll be interesting to see where it goes.
So what would you say, I mean, you guys have crazy good access to Google as a result of what you guys are doing, not just the AMP stuff, but the SEO engine, which is exactly what Google needs for 50 or 43% of the web. I mean, you've got to have really crazy good access to these Google employees where you can maybe even help shape the future of the web, not just, consume whatever, technical things that they're producing.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So having transitioned from an SEO who worked for businesses and in agencies on the receiving side of Google's guidelines, to now being in a position where the relationships are still weird, but there are scenarios where we end up shaping what they do and how they react to and prioritize things, which is pretty weird. I think that said, the thing I have to keep reminding myself, and I'm really learning to be true, is there isn't such thing as Google. There is no company called Google. There are just...
It's Alphabet.
Well, also more abstraction, but in the other direction, there are just teams working on projects, and like this is a big part of why they are so bad at marketing and product. Is they are utterly fragmented internally, and yes, there are overarching strategies and directions and big products, but all the evidence I see suggests that there are lots of itty-bitty projects. It's almost like a university campus. I'm like part of the culture, but yeah, we interact with loads of those different little teams. It's always a bit tense because they really don't like interacting with the outside world. It's a really alien thing for them. It's really awkward and difficult for them to reach out. And there are certainly scenarios where they're either not meant to or not allowed to for various legal reasons, and they have policies within policies. It's messy. That said, the Google teams within the WordPress ecosystem are really open. I found that really interesting. There are 6 or 7 of them working mostly across performance in the WordPress ecosystem, but also bits of security and other stuff. And they are some of the smartest developers I've ever encountered. Incidentally, some of them worked on the AMP plugin for WordPress, which I run on my site. I love this. I used AMP to build my own personal website, powered on WordPress using the AMP plugin, which is built and maintained by Google employees. So while I sleep, Google are making my website faster so that it ranks higher in Google. And like, how do you compete with that? These people are smart. We talk all the time. We collaborate on stuff. I send them bugs. They fix it. It's a really fascinating alien thing. I think it surprises me that there aren't more SEO people more actively involved in the WordPress world, because you just get direct access to these people. They're not the people who are designing the algorithms, but they are involved in that ecosystem. So there's that. The other side is stuff closer to the kind of core or search products. We get little glimpses and little interactions with teams, and my word, is it incredibly frustrating. They are all over the place. They make arbitrary changes to different systems. Like last week, without announcing it, they made a bunch of changes to how they consume product data on pages and threw errors on every page where it was currently implemented. So our support team at Yoast just gets overwhelmed by people saying, Yoast has broken my website. It's like, now Google changed how they consume this arbitrary piece of data. So they're really frustrating to work with. We've got some back channels that we can say, hey, help a little bit, but it's all very unofficial. It's a bit weird. Yeah, they are nightmarish to deal with just because it just seems like chaos on their side.
So I have a bit of a love for DMOZ just because it's kind of where I got started, and as a result, some people pay attention to the things I say I love, and so I got introduced to a company called Blekko, Blekko, that was founded by the same guys who founded DMOZ. So they're like, we're bringing it back, we're doing it all over again. So. I sat down and kind of understood a little bit more about what they were trying to do, and they had some clever ideas, and they were kind of going forward with it. And so I was kind of asking like, well, how are you backfilling the information? Like, where's your data coming from? And like, well, we have an agreement with Yandex, so we share user data with Yandex, and they give us like search data. And I'm like, you're doing what?
Yeah, that sounds perfectly fine.
And I'm like, you realize that's very tightly coupled with the Russian government, right? And they're like, well, like, what would be? Like, it's no problem. Like, we're just giving search data. And I'm like, I don't know how to explain this if you don't.
The deepest, darkest needs and secrets and fears and hopes and dreams of people. Fine.
And so I politely told them I could not help them with that project. Later on, apparently they got bought by IBM Watson, and I have no idea if they still have that integration or not. But
wow.
So I kind of have a similar feeling about like all of these incredibly complex systems. Like from a user's perspective, you're just using this thing over here. Like, you're just using DuckDuckGo. You're just using whatever. But what you really are using is Google, because they have an API back to Google, and they're handing search data to Google and the IP address. Yep. No cookie data, but IP address and search string, which is everything Google. And so, like, I just don't see there being a way that you can really escape that ecosystem unless you fully opt out and go to Bing or...
Yeah, but then even then I've got an Android phone and a Google TV and a Google Assistant in my... I've given in. I've gone, as an end user, the value outweighs the kind of existential fear of all the scary data stuff and am I being manipulated and what if it gets used, etc. In the abstract, that still makes me very uncomfortable, but the utility of it all, and especially as it all integrates and talks to each other, is so good. But yeah, like, what's the alternative? Either completely off the grid, like I can't use maps, I can't use anything, can't translate anything, all the stuff, or hope that Bing somehow at some point innovates disruptively, but I don't see any evidence that they're ever going to invest enough to make that happen. They seem to be quite comfortable to be a distant second place.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that too.
Yeah, the features they do roll out are either chasing Google or kind of minor derivatives.
Well, even the browser, they've given up.
It's Chrome now.
Now it's Chrome. And so they're going to have that same problem where they're always going to have lagging features I just described. Yeah. I really try to convince them, don't do this. Yeah. We were involved in those conversations before they went, and I'm like, do not do this. You're just going to end up behind them, like way behind, 6 months all the time. And they're like, well, it's cheaper, I guess. We want to get rid of 100 employees or whatever, 1,000 employees, whatever it is. One thing about DMOZ and Blekko, though, I think people kind of side-eye and kind of laugh that those are human curated systems.
I really like the idea of that.
I do too, but the thing that I really push back on is not just that I think it's a good idea, or could theoretically be a good idea depending on the implementation, is that Google has that too. They have this enormous content moderation team. It's not they're curating it, but they're curating it in reverse. They're
yes, validating that the system is returning the things that they would expect it to.
Right, and so if you don't have humans in the loop, this doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
You need training data. These systems do not just automatically take care of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the running joke is that all of this machine learning AI stuff is actually just heuristics and checklists. Actually, it's not at all. It's just armies of low-paid humans.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you and I both know people who have theoretically injected themselves into these search quality teams to change the quality, or at least to understand how it works.
Yeah, and Google insists that the search quality rater stuff does not affect the algorithm, but like the whole purpose of the system, presumably, is to evaluate whether the system is behaving the way that they think it is. And if that data says otherwise, then of course that's going to have, yes, they're not going to directly feed that back into their algorithm, but it's going to influence what happens next for sure.
And at a minimum, we know this is at least partially true because we always end up with the most current copy of their rating guidelines.
Which is a fascinating read.
Very interesting.
They're dense, but they're very interesting.
Yeah, about 100 pages or whatever, but worth a read, because that gives you insight into, well, now I should check these tags, and now I should do this. And these are, college kids making $10 an hour or whatever, but they have a very strict set of things they're trying to look for. And if it doesn't fit that exact set of things, you're going to skirt right through their system.
I really love that document, because I think it might be the best resource we have in totality that describes what a good web page looks like. Because there's all sorts of stuff like, does this seem to be trustworthy? Is it obvious who wrote it? Is it obvious that the person who wrote it was an expert in their field? Is it full of typos? And there are 100 dimensions of stuff like this they look at, which all aims to determine if a person searched for toothache, is this good? Is it right? Is it useful? Is it helpful? Is it trustworthy? It's such a phenomenal resource. And if you knew nothing about SEO, and you accept that you needed to make a good page, this would be a damn good resource to use to try and make sure you're getting all the criteria.
Agreed.
Really interesting.
That's a good point. So back to your point about the privacy issues related to all these things. So I think this is worth kind of enumerating, just because people are like, oh, I don't use Google, or they'll say something kind of insane like that. And I'm like, well, you use websites. Those websites use Google Analytics. And they use Picasa, and they use Google Ads, and your buddy uses Gmail even if you don't, and on and on and on. And you really cannot escape it. And I think the biggest indicator that I saw that we have totally lost this privacy war against Google is they said, we're no longer going to read your email. Before that, they had said something like they had 130, 136, I think, signals that they were identifying, and they no longer needed the email. They had enough without it. And so from a signaling perspective, for identifying whether somebody would be interested in something or not, maybe it's their search terms, or maybe it's the 130 other signals that they're tracking.
Aggregate behavioral analysis with abstract labels that we would never align to anything we'd understand.
Right. Sure. So you can say, hey, my site is completely optimized and done blah, 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 but it actually turns out it's the fact that they look at these Picasa messages, or they're using this thing in Google Docs.
And they say very carefully, whenever they're prompted, that we do not do personalization. They do not personalize the search results or anything around it. But that's a very specific set of wording, and they damn well localize it, and it damn well changes on your behavior. So yes, they're never using you to create it's just linguistics at that point, isn't it?
So there really is no way to disappear from them.
No.
And so
certainly not without life-changing costs.
You'd have to live in the woods kind of thing. And I mean, and maybe that's, after listening to this podcast, a lot of people are just going to stop listening to my podcast and live in the woods.
And then the woods will be full and the cities will be a utopia.
But I don't think you can use any one of those signals anymore. I think you can't say, well, I'm going to block ads and therefore Google's not going to see me. You're using Google Fiber. And if you're not using Google Fiber, someone else is using, some Google, elastic compute type thing. You know what I mean? And you're just never going to be able to escape
you're on the
them.
radar, for sure. Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's some interesting pushback on that. There's a couple of countries have now declared that Google Analytics is quote unquote illegal. There's a lot of hyperbole and overreaction, but it's maybe it'll start a chain reaction. A lot of those, unfortunately, are quite specifically focused on the handing of data from the EU to the US, which is one very small part of it. But there's some more interesting stuff, like there's a similar thing with Google Fonts, which typically, if you install Google Fonts on your website, you do by pasting in a few lines of code, and it just so happens that phone's home to Google. You load Google Fonts from a Google domain, which inherently sends them your IP address because you're making a request to a system.
That's right.
And that is also now quasi-illegal. So the site's being fined, Germany, I think, for loading Google Fonts remotely. So we're starting to see some kind of recognition of this, but there isn't a solution. Even if you fix all of these trivial technical details, you still can't escape in totality being part of that system. Definitely not.
So how would you define the difference between PageRank and RankBrain? Like, what was the sort of the big technical delta between those two? And I have an answer and an anecdote afterwards, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Okay, so PageRank was the was where this all started, which was the idea that things that reference other things in a loop, in a network, contain some kind of value. And you can loosely calculate that, and you can work out if one big site links to 10 little sites, each one of those should get 10% of whatever the value metric is. And that was for many, many years the heart, or at least we believe to be the heart, or close to it, of how Google's algorithm worked, independent of all their content analysis and quality metrics. It is very debatable today how significant that is and how much of it still exists. There is definitely a similar concept to that, but it is almost certainly far more sophisticated. To some degree, yeah, the linking from big sites to small sites is still important, but we have no idea how that works. Rank Brain is a very different type of thing, and it's one part of a whole bunch of kind of named capabilities that Google have. They've got very keen on this recently. There was Mum recently as well, and a whole bunch of others. As best we can tell, this is a kind of post-ranking filtering system. This came up in some of the talks earlier, very briefly today at the conference, that they have systems which, if I search for dentists and Google just show me 10 links, that's not going to be the best possible result. The best possible result might be a nearby open dentist, a e-commerce website selling stuff on demand, a map to something. Like, there's a degree of categorization and filtering and deduplication, and it's quite an ambiguous intent. So maybe one of these is going to be informational, maybe one of them is going to be transactional. RankBrain and various other things related to it analyze the search phrase to gain as much context as possible based on the combination and the order of the words, and then apply a whole bunch of post-ranking filtering. So it will go, okay, we should really have no more than 3 e-commerce results in this set because we're not convinced it's a transactional query. Therefore, elevate a map and a YouTube video and try and get this best possible blend whilst taking into account the very specific word ordering of the query, all the external stuff, and then layering in stuff like Google's Mum thing, which is a multimodal, can't remember what it's called, but similar premise that they should do that cross-media format as well. So they should consume all the images and all the video on the web in all the languages and understand it in some kind of machine learning abstract and use that to also influence that filtering model.
So when Bing was first coming out, they had something that was allowing them to train their data. It was like, look at Bing results and Google results side by side. There's this tool they built. And so you type in whatever. And it was a little clunky because they were doing it from their IP address, so all the local search stuff was all for Seattle or wherever. Not Seattle, but wherever. Wherever. They actually have a campus right next to it. I'm spacing on the actual name. Anyway, so I can't believe I can't remember this. Yes. Something like that. But anyway, so the IP address was always the same, and so it was always a little messy, the results. But it was interesting to watch them like, okay, well, if we got worse, the basically just tells the AI that they have on the back end, hey, you're a little worse than Google on this one.
That's sad, isn't it? Just to be
chasing. Yeah. So but it was interesting because there's all this training model, and I had this in the back of my head. But anyway, I went to go visit them in Redmond. That was the word I was looking for. So I went and go visited them, and we're sitting down talking about SEO in general, and they're like, well, what do the SEOs want? And I'm like, well, I think, if you had to give one thing to them, other than better Search Console stuff, it would be the algorithm. Like, how does it work? And they literally looked at me like I was from Mars, and they're like, what do you mean? What algorithm? Yeah. They didn't have it in their head that such a thing could exist. They're like, we just have a black box. Yeah. It's just a system that decides this is better than this, and we don't know how it works. Like, I can give you the code, like it doesn't tell, it doesn't do whatever you think it's doing. We don't know how it works. It's just this little box that just, we input data and that data comes out, and that's how it gets ranked.
And I've had similar conversations with some of them, and they then have similar stuff to rank, but they have the black box and then a post-filtering system that makes sure that whatever comes out is sensible. Otherwise, the thing that ranks the stuff is just completely alien. Nobody knows.
No one knows how that works. I think that is more and more, Bing had the advantage of being second, right? So they get a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the personnel, and
they're not solving the problem, the new problems.
Right, yeah. They can see how they want it to be solved, and so they're building a lot of these things, subsystems, to be built entirely off of a black box. Where Google's retrofitting, they're building all this stuff post-mortem, and therefore it's taking longer, and that would make sense. I mean, that's kind of how things work. But I think that's where they're going. I think they're chasing Bing in a weird way, and like we're just gonna have this thing be an entirely black box where we're not gonna know anything about what's happening. It just
train each other. It's horrible, isn't it? Wow.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I'm nervous about the intersect of SEO and machine learning, especially when it comes to content and people chasing other people. There are so many tools, like, again, because SEO is hard strategically, it's all about quality, etc. You need to be scaling helpful content. A lot of people look for shortcuts. And the shortcut of the day is using machine learning and AI systems to either completely generate or to supplement content writing processes. And the problem with all of these systems, almost all of them, and all the SEO tools and platforms, including some of them represented here today, they start from the basis of look at what is already ranking, do some kind of gap analysis versus your site, and then fill in the gaps. And you end up, all these systems and all this content ends up just chasing itself. Because as soon as you do that, the next person does that, and you are recursively optimizing from a very small corpus till it's all just word soup. And I don't really see a way out of this. And if the search engines are doing that too, so you brands who are just chasing each other to put the right amount of keywords in the right place because Bing rewards them, and then Bing is like, we just create noise. It's really unpleasant.
So what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? I desperately want all of this to be fixed and better, and it frustrates me greatly that it's not. I think the web already has been and can be a phenomenal force for good, but it's still nascent, it's still very early, and it's frustrating that it is still tactical and people are lazy or stupid or whatever.
And we already have decades of technical debt already.
Oh, yeah, how have we managed that? Yeah, so I'm obsessed by performance. Because there are well-lit paths to performance. Yeah. Somehow everything sucks. Mm-hmm. I'm obsessed about structured data and a connected web and a slightly less utopian vision than the Tim Berners-Lee kind of Web3 thing. But I think there is an incredible world to unlock with connected data and structured data and schema. I'm deeply fascinated by that. But again, with the way that the ad-based commercial web works and the inability of businesses to invest in quality, the thing that keeps me up at night is maybe this is as good as it gets and maybe it gets worse. And I want to be a force for good, and I want to see all this stuff unfold. I want a more incredible connected world of flying cars and whatever. I'm nervous that this is as far as we get.
Interesting.
Profoundly upsetting.
That is. I don't know if it's that desperate yet, but your fears are not unfounded. Mm. All right. Well, on that lovely note, well, how do people follow you online? How do people get in contact with you?
I'm all over Twitter at Jono Alderson. Go to jonoalderson.com, or you can go find me at Yoast. I'm at various conferences all over the tech scene. You can email me at jonoalderson.com, or just put me into Google. That works. Use a search engine.
Use a search engine.
Use a Google. Yeah. Or another Google-derived service.
Jono, thanks so much for doing this, man.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Nice.